situations, circumstances, things that are happening, we try to control those things, don't we? There's a name that's been thrown around for something like that for many, many years, and that person is commonly referred to as a control freak. And that's the essence of what that video was about. A hockey player interacting in this environment, trying to control everything, much like we do oftentimes. Even though we're virtually in control of very little in our lives, we still try to control many things that we have no business controlling. They're not ours to control. So that's thus the title. And in number 3, in part 3 of the series, Can You Go Home Again? You may be a freak, but you're not in control. You're not in control. And we're going to look at the text today. Actually, we're going to look at a couple different texts today, as you see there. And we're ultimately going to ask the question, what is it in our lives, or what is God in control of in our lives? What exactly does God control in our lives? If we're not really in control of anything, what is God in control of? Because the easy answer is to say, well, He's in control of everything. Okay, and He is. But what exactly? What exactly? What is God in control of in our lives? Last week, we looked at God's people, the Israelites, as they were going home from slavery in Babylon. God had worked in His people. He worked in the heart of the king to send His people back to their homeland. And they began to build the altar where they could offer sacrifices and live a life of sacrificial obedience to Him. And then He gave them the ability to rebuild the temple. Now, of course, there were those that didn't think the temple was as good as it was in the old days. But nonetheless, God worked in His people to rebuild the place of worship for them. Because He had a plan for His people to reclaim and rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and to rebuild the place of worship, ultimately rebuild His people from the inside out. But as they're going along, everything was not smooth sailing for God's people. It seems last week like a lot of things just kind of worked out for Him, because God was in those things. He was in control of it. But sometimes in our lives, God is still in a situation, and yet things don't come off flawlessly. They are not smooth. Sometimes things come up, and we begin to ask the question, God, what are you doing here? I know you're in control of this, but what is happening here? Why aren't things just working out the way that I think that they should? And we begin to question God's control in these situations. We begin to question God's control in our life in general. And so today we're going to look at these texts and see what exactly is God in control of in our lives. And we see in Ezra chapter 4, we see the first 3 chapters of Ezra, 1, 2, and 3, were about the people going back to the homeland and beginning to rebuild the place of worship and rebuild the temple and the altar and so forth. Chapter 4, they begin to build some other things, but they run into some issues and situations. And we see, beginning in Ezra chapter 4, of course, time-wise, this is going to put us, as you can see there, right in the middle of the rebuild of the temple. And we're going to look at a couple different sections that are a little bit out of time today. Ezra includes them for narrative purposes in order to illustrate a point, but they're going to be a little bit in the future. But for the most part, we're still going to be right around the time of the end of the temple being rebuilt and go a little bit into that gap in between before people were actually completely reformed and we move into the other buildings. So we're going to see, what is God in control? We see the first thing that God is in control of in our lives is the obstacles that we face. God is in control of the obstacles that we face. And those obstacles can be many and varied, but yet God is in control of all of those, as we see in Ezra chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Now when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel. We know Zerubbabel was the guy who led the people back in the first return from exile. They approached Zerubbabel and the heads of fathers' houses and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been offering sacrifices to Him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." But Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and the rest of the heads of fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us." So as the rebuilding is going along, the Israelites, God's people, things are working out and they're getting the temple built, and some people who lived in the surrounding areas came to their leaders and said, "Hey, looks like things are going good here. What do you say that we join up with you? You know, maybe increase the task force a little bit. You know, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to, because we worship the same God that you do. You know, you should be able to work with you and everything should be fine that way. And as a result, then, you know, you should be willing to let us do that." Now, what these guys weren't being upfront about, there's a couple things actually they weren't being upfront about. All the nations surrounding Israel and God's people, they hated them. They hated God's people. They hated the Israelites. They didn't want them to rebuild and become strong. What these guys in particular are doing is seeking to infiltrate the ranks of God's people and sabotage them from the inside out. And they try to convince them and persuade them to be okay with them coming along by saying that they worship the same God. Now, the problem with this is that when they made that statement, they left out the part about them worshiping all kinds of other gods too, in addition to Yahweh. So they were, in essence, trying to dilute the faith of God's people for the one true God. But on the surface, they said, we worship the same God that you do. That should be okay. And what we see here first, the very first obstacle that we can face, that God is still in control of, even though sometimes we wonder when we look at the situations, humanly speaking, we see that one obstacle we can encounter is a tendency to compromise in our relationships. To let our guard down. To say, well, okay, I'm going to let it go a little bit here, and maybe things will work out well, and so forth and so on. And we have a tendency to compromise in our relationships. And that can be an obstacle to us fulfilling what God's plan is for us. Because sometimes relationships and so forth that come into our lives can lead us away from where God wants us to be. Where God wants us to be. And we see that with these people. They came in and they said, why don't we join up with you, begin a working relationship with you, and since it should be okay since we worship the same God, why don't you just let your guard down a little bit? And ultimately, these outside people were seeking to destroy God's people on the inside. No. It's very subtle. It's very subtle. And that can happen to all of us if we're not discerning in who we get close to in our relationships before God and in general. The first obstacle that God is still in control of, the first obstacle is a tendency to compromise in our relationships. But there are other obstacles that we see in this section. Those outside influences and forces don't stop there. We see that the next obstacle that we can encounter is discouragement and intimidation. So God's people take a stand and they say, no, we believe God has called us to rebuild this city, rebuild this temple, rebuild all this, and He wants us to do it alone. God, Yahweh, the one true God. We don't want to have any part with you and your pantheon of gods and all the different gods that you worship. We believe that we're called out, set apart to do this, and we're not going to compromise. So what does the enemy do? Beginning in verse 4, we see, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah, God's people, and made them afraid to build. So they're discouraging them. They're tearing them down. They're saying things. Even in some cases, believe they were being abusive. There were physical attacks even. It says that they made them afraid to build. They were seeking to cause fear and intimidation in their lives so that they wouldn't continue moving in the direction that God wanted them to go. And sometimes in our lives, we can get into situations where we deal with people who heavily discourage us and try to intimidate us into not following and serving God in the way that we should. Sometimes the manipulation is more subtle than others. It can be passive aggression, but nonetheless, it's aggression. Because there are people who don't want us to follow and serve God, because they believe very differently. And some people even hate God. And they'll do whatever they can to tear you and your faith down. This has been happening for thousands of years. It still happens today to God's people, His followers, to believers. And it says that they were trying to instill a spirit of fear in them. They were discouraging them to make them afraid to continue progressing